Welcome to the National Gallery. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here. And this is the last presentation in this month's program called Words and Images, where we deal with a sort of the relationship between the visual and the verbal. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Binion's poem is probably the one that's always read at commemorations of the war and at various remembrances of the war. The Lawrence Binion poem is particularly thought of as that kind of commemorative poem. We're going to be reading and looking at the poetry of the war across national boundaries, not just in England, but how it affected many of the countries that participated in the war. So on the screen is the August 5th, 1914 front page of the Times in London, announcing that Britain was now at war. That was 1914. Of course, America did not come into the war until 1917, and that's an American newspaper on the right, or that's no longer with us. The New York American, April 6th, 1917. Of course, there was a lot of initial patriotism and jingoism about going to war, and it sort of gets encapsulated in recruitment posters. And I'm sure you know some of these. One of the most famous is the one on the far left, which is the English poster that depicts Lord Kitchener, and it was created by Alfred Leet. And it says, "Britain's Lord Kitchener wants you join your country's army. God Save the King." 1914 is the date. Of course, we plagiarized that poster. The American James Montgomery Flagg knew the Kitchener poster, which was very famous. And so he created the Uncle Sam poster, the one in the center, in 1917. What people don't sometimes realize is that poster was used both to recruit in the First War and in the Second World War. So it was actually created in 1917. And essentially replicating this finger pointing, which was such a dramatic kind of gesture to engage the viewer. And then, of course, the Germans got in on it as well. So this is a German poster from 1919, just after the end of the First World War. It's by Julius Engelhard. And what it's saying there in all that script: "You should join the Reichswehr too, so report to the nearest recruiting office," and then it gives the address and all the information. What's interesting and, of course, noticeable here is that this finger pointing was seen by all of these designers and illustrators as a way of sort of directly engaging the viewer. There is a Russian version of this as well that I'm going to show you later when we get to Russia. So 1914 is the beginning of the war, and the First World War is a special kind of war in terms of tactics and strategies. Of course, it was dominated by trench warfare. Initially, the Germans came into France by way of Belgium. This had been a plan that they had planned for many years called the Schlieffen Plan. It didn't quite work out the way they had hoped. They made inroads into France, but then they were stopped, and it became a stalemate. But by that time, the Germans had taken most of the high ground, and then what happened was that the opposing armies just dug in trenches. But it's important that the German trenches were on higher ground than the Allied trenches. So in terms of flooding and the things that would happen, it was less of a problem for the German army than it was for the French and the British troops. Just in terms of sort of statistics, the French and British troops were typically only 2 to 3 feet above sea level, which wasn't much, especially when it started to rain. Of course, this is an empty trench here on the left, showing you what it looked like, and sort of the battlefront, the Western Front. Here, don't be fooled though, the trenches were a huge network of snaking trenches, not just along that one sort of place where where they met. Of course, this was the first truly mechanized war in which we had tanks and aircraft, submarines, all kinds of destructive weapons, in addition to things like poison gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas. What finally actually broke the stalemate of trench warfare towards the end was the use of tanks. You saw that picture of a tank going across a trench in the clip that you just saw. These are Canadian soldiers sleeping and writing letters in the trench here on the left. One of the biggest problems, of course, because of the dampness and the wetness, and sometimes you were standing in 2 or 3 feet of water, was problems related to your feet, most especially to what came to be known as trench foot. And here you see the soldiers having their feet inspected on the right. Here is a photograph of a soldier in the trench. This is an Allied trench, a French trench, where you could see how deep the water could be. And that's a case of trench foot photographed on the right, taken during the First World War. This prolonged exposure to dampness, to rain, could lead first to gangrene and then very often to amputation. One of the biggest problems the soldiers had was keeping their socks dry. And so this was one of the gifts that people from the home front would always send their sons, and they would knit socks, because to keep their socks dry was particularly important. The British had what they called a stamping drill, where everybody stood up and stamped their feet to keep the blood sort of circulating into their extremities. Of course, the mechanization of the war, most especially the use in terms of trench warfare of the machine guns, was particularly destructive. Both sides implemented and used machine gun emplacements. This is a German emplacement on the left, and here are some British soldiers on the right coming out of their trench. The trench warfare was these long, prolonged periods of boredom where you did nothing but sit in your trench, and then all of a sudden it would be decided to have an assault on an opposing trench. Between the trenches of the two armies was a land simply referred to as no man's land, and that was filled with barbed wire and sometimes underground mines, etc. And so one army decided to finally make an advance. They were more or less mowed down by machine guns. They would retreat. After a period, the other army would decide to do the same thing. They would come forward. They would be mowed down by machine guns, and that's the way it sort of unfolded. So here is again a machine gun emplacement on the right, but here you notice that the soldiers are wearing gas masks, because the use of both chlorine and mustard gas during the war led to some particularly horrible medical problems, and sometimes even ultimately to death. Let me read you one poem about the trenches. It's by Isaac Rosenberg, one of the great British war poets that most people know, and the poem is called "Break of Day in the Trenches." What he uses here as the motif through the poem is the image of a rat, and that in the trenches they would be filled often with rats. And that would affect, of course, both armies. The rats didn't take sides in the conflict. So the title of this poem was "Break of Day in the Trenches." The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer, sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German, soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass, strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chance than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop, and are ever dropping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. So we have here the reference to the rat, but also to the poppy, which becomes an important metaphor and symbol for the war. Poppies are one of the few flowers that can grow on a devastated landscape that's been sort of thrown up by bombing and warfare. And the other thing that poem is interesting at showing us is his point of view, where he is low in the trench. And sometimes you're eye to eye with a rat or with something. Sometimes you're eye to eye with a corpse, and you can't get out and away from that. And that's interesting for artists because, for example, George Braque writes about the fact that his view of the world, he was wounded in the war, I'll show you that later, that his view of the world changed because of points of view and things that he experienced in the war. When your face is in the mud, and then you turn and you look at something obliquely or in a way that you had never really seen it before. And that kind of juxtaposition was something that stayed with him for a long period of time. So here, everybody had their own gas mask style. And here, from left to right, is an American gas mask, a British, a French, and a German. This is a photograph from around 1918. The gas mask itself finds its way into visual imagery. The example I would give you is our sculpture by Giacometti of the figure holding the void. If you know that bronze sculpture, the face of that sculpture is very much affected by Giacometti's awareness of gas masks. The effect of gas here, this is a group, this is the British 55th West Lancashire Division. They were blinded by gas, and they're awaiting treatment. Most often when they had bandages around their eyes, these were bandages soaked in water to try to alleviate the pain of the gas in the eyes. So here's no man's land. On the left, this is in fact near Flanders Field in Belgium. On the right is an American soldier entangled in the barbed wire that was present between the rival trenches. One of the problems with no man's land was the fact that very often, if a soldier fell and was entangled in the wire and was wounded, either not seriously or perhaps seriously, this soldier might be groaning through the night, and his fellow soldiers couldn't go out to try to find him because it was too dangerous. So there were situations where you would listen to somebody dying while you were in your trench, sort of helpless. So the poem In Flanders Fields, which I'll read to you in a few minutes, is a poem about the death in this sort of no man's land. It was actually a poem written by a Canadian physician, John McCrae. But I'm going to save that and read it to you in a few minutes. One of the great heroes of the war, or I guess heroines of the war, was the American Anna Coleman Ladd. And she was an artist. She was an American sculptor. She was born in Pennsylvania in Bryn Mawr, and she was educated in Paris and in Rome. She spent most of her adult life in Massachusetts, but she wanted to help the soldiers who had suffered from facial disfiguration. So she set up a studio in Paris where she would make these masks to try to cover the disfiguration of a soldier. So this work is called anaplastology. So it's making a mask or some kind of treating or restoring a malformed figure through artificial means, through, in this case, making an actual mask. These masks would be fit to the person's disfiguration, and then they usually were thin sheets of copper. Then they would be touched up and painted to match the skin tone of the individual. And most often they were attached by having the mask have glasses that the loops behind the ear of the eyeglasses would be what was holding the mask in place. So here she is working on this soldier who's got the mask on. This is before and after a treatment. Here she is on the right These are some of her assistants. The first thing that would be done in this process was to make a plaster cast of the actual person's disfiguration, so you could see how badly disfigured they were. And then by using the plaster mask or cast, you could then begin to fit a mask that would hide this part of the disfiguration. Here's the eyeglass idea here. Now I'm going to show you another short 4-minute video that is, in fact, Anna Coleman-Ladd going to work in Paris. Her studio is in Paris, and she's attending to some of these soldiers. Okay, so you see the degree to which soldiers were wounded in terms of actual disfigurations, amputations, but also, of course, most especially psychic wounds, what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder, what was called in the First World War shell shock. We keep changing the terminology for that. In the Second World War, it was battle fatigue. It went from a shock to a fatigue to a disorder over time, but it was equally painful and long term. What I'm showing you now is Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey here on the left, the south transept. And this has been a space at Westminster Abbey that is where many important poets are interred, English poets, some not English actually, but in most cases they're English. And the first one who was laid to rest here is Geoffrey Chaucer, so it has a long history. But on November 11th, Armistice Day in 1985, a new plaque was unveiled. It's the plaque on the right, which is a stone slab that was inscribed with the names of 16 eminent World War I poets. And around the perimeter in red of their names was a line from Wilfred Owen, which actually comes from a preface to one of his volumes of poems, but it's a very famous line where he writes, "My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those names. We've already read a poem by Isaac Rosenberg about the trenches. Here are some of the poets. From left to right on the top is Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and then across left to right on the bottom is Isaac Rosenberg. We just read his poem. Vera Brittain and Charles Sorley. Now, I'm obviously not going to read poems by all 16 of these poets because I also want to cover poetry that wasn't just from Britain. But in any case, these are among the most famous, the Brits are among the most famous World War I poets. It's hard to think of any war that gave us as much poetry, ironically, as the First World War. It also is the war that wiped out an entire generation of British soldiers and young men, many of whom were these poets who did not survive the war, most especially Wilfred Owen, who was killed just before the armistice. The evolution of World War I poetry during the war in Britain is interesting, and the person who sets the tone that pretty much everybody will react against as the war goes on is Rupert Brooke. Brooke is considered one of the great war poets, but his approach to the war at its outbreak is what we would call today sort of super patriotic and maybe jingoistic. In other words, let's go and win for England. And it was a very kind of patriotic approach that almost everybody, once they got into the war, began to react against, most especially Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. So let me read you a good example of a Brooke poem that sort of shows you what we're talking about. This is a poem called "The Soldier," and it comes from a collection of his poems titled From 1914. So notice, 1914, the war has just started. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave, once, her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the internal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. That's the poem Sassoon hated. and as did many others. But that established Rupert Brooke as a kind of poet of the war, but in this kind of positive sort of sense. There is a poem by Wilfred Owen called, arguably his most famous poem, Dulce et decorum est, in which he sort of takes he disagrees particularly strongly, you might say, with that view of the war, and I'll get to that in a second. So maybe we should read now some of a few of Owen's poems. Actually, I think we'll do Sassoon first. He's older. So here is Siegfried Sassoon on the left and Wilfred Owen on the right, and this is the location, the place where they first met, which was the Craig Luckhart Hospital, War Hospital in Edinburgh, Scotland. This is where British soldiers, but you had to be an officer, not an enlisted man, would come to sort of deal with the effects of shell shock. And both Sassoon and Owen were there. Sassoon's situation was complicated by politics because he had issued a very strong anti-war declaration that had been published in the Times. And so some people felt they were throwing him in here to keep him quiet. But he did, in fact, suffer from shell shock. So this is where these two poets meet. And Owen already idolized Sassoon. He had read his poetry. And he meets Sassoon, and they begin to talk about poetry. And the thing, Owen's poetry was shaped by English Romantic traditions, Keats and Shelley and Byron. And he was continuing to write in that mode, even during the war. And Sassoon was the one who suggested, maybe you should write about the war. And Owen gave up then on the sort of romantic bent and began to write some of the greatest war poetry. So first, let's read a poem by Sassoon, one that you've probably heard of. By the way, the poems I'm choosing, I'm trying to stay with relatively short ones. This is a poem by Siegfried Sassoon called Does It Matter? Does it matter losing your legs? For people will always be kind, and you need not show that you mind when the others come in after hunting to gobble their muffins and eggs. Does it matter losing your sight? There's such splendid work for the blind, and people will always be kind as you sit on the terrace, remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams from the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad, and people won't say that you're mad, for they'll know you fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit. So that's a Sassoon poem. Again, that's a sort of rebuke of Rupert Brooke. And then we get to Wilfred Owen, and we'll go right to the arguably his most famous poem, Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of the gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from his froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores of innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is right and just to die for one's country. That comes from Horace, one of the odes of the Roman writer Horace. And so he's inverting that. He calls it here a lie. So that's clearly in contrast to the kinds of poems that Rupert Brooke was writing. Let's read a few other Wilfred Owen poems. This one is called Soldier's Dream. Almost all of Owen's poems were published posthumously. He might have written them during the war, but they were published later. This is Soldier's Dream. I dreamed kind Jesus followed the big gun gears and caused a permanent stoppage in all bolts, and buckled with a smile Mausers and Colts, and rusted every bayonet with his tears. And there were no more bombs, of ours or theirs, not even an old flintlock, not even a pike'll, but God was vexed and gave all power to Michael, and when I woke, he'd seen to our repairs. So the war goes on. There's another, sometimes Owen's poems have a religious bent. He was raised in an Anglican sort of household. This one is called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. And then there's another famous one, which is Anthem for Doomed Youth. He went back and forth about the word doomed. We have many of his manuscripts, his original manuscripts, and sometimes the manuscripts actually have notations on them in the hand of Siegfried Sassoon, who was making comments about changes he might want to make. So this is Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their nasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. So that's the Anthem for a Doomed Youth. Here is John McCrae on the right, the Canadian physician who served in the war. He did serve at the front, but then it was considered that he was more valuable behind the lines to set up hospitals and oversee medical care. This is a photograph of his funeral on the left, which took place in France. He's buried in France. He died on January 28th, 1918. He's, of course, the poet most associated with the poem In Flanders Fields. And it relates directly, again, to this image of the poppy. We saw Isaac Rosenberg talking about putting a poppy behind his ear from when he was in the trench. So let's, this is a poem I'm sure you probably have heard. It's one of the most famous. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark, still bravely singing, flies scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. So that's the McCrae poem. That's become sort of synonymous in some ways with the war. He died of, he didn't die from, well, he did or he didn't. He contracted pneumonia that turned into meningitis. And then he died as a result of that, and then was buried in Vimeru Cemetery, which is here. This is his funeral. This is Vera Brittain, whose story is an interesting one and a sad one, as almost all these stories are sad. She lost her fiancé in the war. She lost her brother in the war. And she lost her two closest male friends in the war. She was an avowed pacifist and a feminist who suffered these losses. Her memoir, which you may have heard of, Testament of Youth, was published in 1933, and it's one of the great sort of autobiographies in some ways. It was an instant hit when it came out. It sold 120,000 copies over 6 years. She was a member of what was called the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or VAD for short, and the nurses who were part of this were often referred to as VADs. They came for the most part from Britain's middle and upper classes, and these were women who were not used to serving others, shall we say. They had all come from affluent backgrounds, and in fact, initially, these women were not allowed to serve in hospitals because the military authorities just didn't think they were equipped to deal with what they would have to do because of their lack of experience. In any case, Vera Brittain did come from that kind of background, but she became a very important nurse in the VAD, and she initially served in England, and she was transferred to Malta and also to France. The poem that she writes about the death of her brother is one of her most famous. It's called To My Brother. Now, this is interesting. It was written in 1918, but she's writing about her brother serving at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and he had served with distinction and had been awarded the Military Cross. So she's writing in 1918, but she's writing about her brother's service in 1916. Your battle wounds are scars upon my heart. That's probably the most famous phrase that has resonated over time. Scars upon my heart. Received when in that grand and tragic show you played your part 2 years ago. And silver in the summer morning sun, I see the symbol of your courage glow. That cross you won 2 years ago. Though now again you watch the shrapnel fly and hear the guns that daily louder grow, as in July 2 years ago. May you endure to lead the last advance, and with your men pursue the flying foe once in France 2 years ago. Now, she wrote that poem in 1918. He had survived the battle in 1916 at the Somme, and 4 days after she wrote that poem, he was killed in Italy. He was killed at the Austrian offensive on the Italian front at Isonzo on June 15th, 1918. There are many, many tragedies about timing in this war, about people who messages didn't reach them in time, or deferments, or things like that, and or people who were killed within 1 or 2 days of the armistice, but they didn't know that there had been an armistice, things of that nature. Now, another one of the great poets is considered one of the great poets is of course, Robert Graves. But I'm not going to read you his poetry. I'm going to read you an excerpt from this book, which is his memoir of the war, Goodbye to All That. Graves enlists in 1914. He serves with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he's wounded at the Battle of the Somme by a shell fragment that went through his lung, and they expected him not to survive that wound, but in fact, at one point he was pronounced dead. But he did end up surviving, and then he was hospitalized and spent the rest of the war in England. But he writes one of the great autobiographies, memoirs of the war, And I'm going to just read you one passage. The average life expectancy of an infantry subaltern on the Western Front was, at some stages of the war, only about 3 months, by which time he had been either wounded or killed. The proportions worked out at about 4 wounded to every killed. Of these 4, 1 got wounded seriously, and the remaining 3 more or less lightly. The 3 lightly wounded returned to the front after a few weeks or months of absence, and again faced the same odds. Flying casualties were even higher. So those people who were pilots had even higher casualties. Then in another passage, he writes this: I spent the rest of the watch in acquainting myself with the geography of the trench section, finding how easy it was to get lost among cul-de-sacs and disused alleys. Twice I overshot the company frontage and wandered among the Munster Fusiliers on the left. Once I tripped and fell with a splash into deep mud. At last my watch ended with the first signs of dawn. I passed the word along the line for the company to stand to arms. Going towards company headquarters to wake the officers, I saw a man lying on his face in a machine gun shelter. I stopped and said, "Stand to there." I flashed my torch on him and saw that one of his feet was bare. The machine gunner beside him said, "No good talking to him, sir." I asked, "What's wrong? Why has he taken his boot and sock off?" "Look for yourself, sir." I took the sleeper by the arm and noticed suddenly the hole in the back of his head. He had taken off the boot and the sock to pull the trigger of his rifle with one toe. The muzzle was in his mouth. "Why did he do it?" I asked. "He went through the last push, sir, and that sent him a bit queer. On top of that, he got bad news from Limerick about his girl and another chap." So this attempt that's a suicide, but there were attempts to maim oneself just to be able to be sent back from the front. Graves led a very long life. I mean, he survived the war and actually lived until 1985. He died at the age of 90. Then we have our own Ernest Hemingway. And here's a 1919 photo of Hemingway on the left during the war, just after the war, and then when he was in Milan on the right in 1918. In remember, America enters the war in 1917, but a number of Americans wanted to serve in the war before that. And one of the vehicles for that would be to volunteer in the ambulance corps of various countries to drive an ambulance. And that's what Hemingway did. When America did join the war in 1918, Hemingway tried to join the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, and he was turned down each time because he had poor eyesight. In any case, when he served in this ambulance corps in the Italian Army, he was seriously wounded on July 8th and in 1918. And despite his wounds, which were severe, they pulled out 227 fragments of shrapnel from his body. He assisted other Italian soldiers to safety, and for that he received the Italian Silver Medal of Bravery, the first American to ever receive that medal from the Italian government. He was released from the hospital in January of 1919. Here he is in his hospital bed on the left. And on the right was an article that had been written that he was in the ward with another American named Henry Villard. We know him from architectural history, the Villard Apartments in New York. But in any case, he had been wounded. He was sort of a few beds away from Hemingway, and they got to know each other. And later, Villard wrote this little essay about Hemingway with the title, "A Prize Specimen of Wounded Hero." And that phrase came from the nurses who were treating Hemingway. They would, whenever people would visit, they would say, "Well, here is our prize specimen of a wounded hero," and then they would go visit Hemingway. In that essay on the right, Villard gives this description of Hemingway. He says, quote, "Hemingway was a good-looking son of a gun, I thought, lying there fresh-faced and clean-shaven on the white painted iron bedstead. He had a strong jaw and a wide boyish grin that revealed an even row of dazzling white teeth, and his jet-black hair and dark eyes contrasted starkly with the snowy pillows that propped up his shoulders, as he reclined at full length, one leg in a plaster cast, the other swathed in bandages. This is when Hemingway meets the the nurse who would become the sort of inspiration for the heroine Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms. So this is Hemingway on crutches on the left in Milan in 1918, and on the right is Hemingway with Agnes von Kurowski. She was an American, not a Brit. She was American, serving in the Red Cross. And they fell in love. In fact, at one point he proposed to her. They were separated for a while, and she ended up marrying an Italian. So that didn't quite work out for Hemingway. These are the first editions of the two books that have direct sort of implications and relations to the war. The Sun Also Rises on the left, published in 1926, and A Farewell to Arms on the right, published in 1929. Of course, the whole Paris generation, the so-called lost generation that Gertrude Stein had sort of defined, was essentially related to the events of the First World War. That was true with Hemingway, with Dos Passos, with F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, all of these individuals. I'm going to read you just a couple of passages from A Farewell to Arms. You've probably heard these. They're two of the most famous. Hemingway writes this: "We won't talk about losing. There is enough talk about losing. What has been done this summer cannot have been done in vain. I did not say anything. I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had heard them, sometimes standing in the rain, almost out of earshot, so that only the shouted words came through, and had read them on proclamations that were slapped up by bill posters over other proclamations now for a long time. And I had seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory. And the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago, if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally, only the names of places had dignity. Certain numbers were the same way, and certain dates, and these with the names of the places were all you could say and have them mean anything. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates." That's one passage. And then later he writes, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry." John Dos Passos and E.E. Cummings served in the war as volunteers, as ambulance drivers. We always know about Hemingway, but some of his cohorts as well. They were in the ambulance corps that was called the American Volunteer Motor Ambulance Corps, but it was later known by a different name, the Norton Harjes Unit. And in that ambulance corps, in that unit, many famous American writers volunteered, and at one point that was referred to as, quote, "the most distinguished of the lost generation's finishing schools." This is John Dos Passos on the left in his uniform from 1917, and that's E.E. Cummings on the right. In 1918 in Massachusetts. What's interesting about E.E. Cummings is that he volunteers to fight in the war before America enters. Then he comes back, and then he's drafted. So he kind of gets it both ways. Dos Passos' first novel, One Man's Initiation, 1917, which was written in 1920, was essentially his recollection of life in the trenches, and it is set in that period. E.E. Cummings wrote about the war in his novel called The Enormous Room from 1922. Cummings' situation was interesting because he was serving with the French. He volunteered with the French army, and during the war he was starting to say a lot of things that were anti-war. So the French started to think he might be a spy. And so then they arrested him and they put him into a prison camp. and the enormous room refers to his time in this detention camp when he was serving his sort of sentence. But he wrote poetry as well about the war, and the one I'm going to read you again, it's pretty famous. This is called My Sweet Old Etc. My sweet old etc., Aunt Lucy, during the recent war could, and what is more, did tell you just what everybody was fighting for. My sister Isabel created hundreds and hundreds of socks, not to mention shirts, flea-proof, ear warmers, etc., wristers, etc. My mother hoped that I would die, etc. Bravely, of course, my father used to become hoarse, talking about how it was a privilege, and if he only could. Meanwhile, myself, etc., lay quietly in the deep mud, etc., dreaming, etc., of your smile, eyes, knees, and of your etc. So that's Cummings' poem. Certainly the most important piece of literature to come out of the war is not written by an American, it's written by a German, and that's Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. That's not the original title in German. Those of you who know German can read the original title. The original title in German is In the West, Nothing New. But that got changed to what we know the title to be. So that's the first edition cover on the left from January 29, 1929. Remarque, that's a photograph of Remarque, obviously on the right in his uniform. He's conscripted into the German army in 1916. He's immediately sent to the front line. He serves on the Western Front from June 26th until July 31st, 1917, when he's wounded by shrapnel in the left leg, right arm, and his neck. He's repatriated to an army hospital in Germany and basically spends the rest of his wartime in the hospital and outside of the fighting. I'm not going to be talking about all of the other Continental writers who remark upon the war. There are many famous books, Haschek's The Good Soldier Zevjek, and Joseph Roth's The Radetzky March. These are other novels. But I'm going to just read one of the most famous passages from Remarque. This is towards the end of the book. It is autumn. There are not many of the old hands left. I am the last of the 7 fellows from our class. Everyone talks of peace and armistice. All wait. If it again proves an illusion, then they will break up. Hope is high. It cannot be taken away again without an upheaval. If there is not peace, then there will be revolution. I have 14 days rest because I have swallowed a bit of gas. In the little garden, I sit the whole day long in the sun. The armistice is coming soon. I believe it now, too. Then we will go home. Here, my thoughts stop and will not go any farther. All that meets me, all that floods over me, are but feelings. Greed of life, love of home, yearning for the blood, intoxication of deliverance, but no aims. Had we returned home in 1916, out of the suffering and the strength of our experiences, we might have unleashed a storm. Now, if we go back, we will be weary, broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. We will not be able to find our way anymore. And men will not understand us. For the generation that grew up before us, though it has passed these years with us, already had a home and a calling. Now it will return to its old occupations, and the war will be forgotten. And the generation that has grown up after us will be strange to us and push us aside. We will be superfluous, even to ourselves. We will grow older. A few will adapt themselves. Some others will merely submit, and most will be bewildered. The years will pass, and in the end, we shall fall into ruin. And perhaps all this that I think is perhaps all this that I think is mere melancholy and dismay, which will fly away as the dust when I stand once again beneath the poplars and listen to the rustling of their leaves. It cannot be that it has gone, the yearning that made our blood unquiet, the unknown, the perplexing, the oncoming things, the thousand faces of the future, the melodies from dreams and from books, the whispers and divinations of women. It cannot be that this has vanished in bombardment, in despair, in brothels. Here the trees show gay and golden. The berries of the rowan stand red among the leaves. Country roads run white out to the skyline, and the canteens hum like beehives with rumors of peace. I stand up. I am very quiet. Let the months and years come. They can take nothing from me. They can take nothing more. I am so alone and so without hope that I can confront them without fear. The life that has borne me through these years is still in my hands and my eyes. Whether I have subdued it, I know not. But so long as it is there, it will seek its own way out, heedless of the will that is within me. Now, you have to remember that sentiment is often being declared by men who are 17 and 18 and 19 years old, which is doubly frightening. Here's a photograph on the left of Ford Madox Ford with James Joyce and Ezra Pound and John Quinn, taken in Paris in 1923. And on the right is T.S. Eliot with Virginia Woolf, photographed in 1924. Another book of the First World War, a novel, is Ford Madox Ford's Parade's End. That influenced a number of British writers. Of course, the writings of Woolf and Eliot dealt with the war, even some of the works of James Joyce. The work, I'm not talking also about music, thank God, because we would obviously really be here. But certain pieces of music, even before the war, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in 1913, but after the war, an opera like Wozzeck by Alban Berg, which deals with a German soldier and the aftermath of the war, that was written between 1914 and 1922, but it premiered in 1925. So we're setting aside music for the moment. But Eliot's The Wasteland is one of the great sort of statements about the war. This is a photograph of Eliot in 1923, and this is the journal on the right, the Criterion, that he founded and was the editor of. And this is where The Wasteland first appeared. You can see it there in the table of contents. It appeared in this journal in October of 1922. So The Wasteland, by many, is considered one of the most important, certainly one of the most important poems of the 20th century. But I don't think it could have been written without having come through the First World War and the turmoil and the devastation of the war. The poem sort of captures the confusion, the destruction, this existential despair. The way I think of The Wasteland is that it's not a person having a nervous breakdown, it's a civilization having a nervous breakdown. Let's read, again, it's a long poem. I'm going to just read the beginning of the third part, which is titled, What the Thunder Said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces and after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit, here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. So that's just the beginning of that part of the wasteland. Again, the whole poem really is about breakdowns. Everything is breaking down. Relationships, marriages, the world order, communication, poetry is breaking down, language is breaking down as far as Eliot's concerned. How the heck are we supposed to make sense of anything after this colossal devastation of the First World War? In many ways, the poem is a cry of despair. It's a kind of a shout into the void. Now, I want to obviously start to look at some art as well, and we now have this wonderful room, which we did not have until recently, devoted to German Expressionism because of the gifts of Arnold and Joan Salzman. So this was an area we were particularly weak in, German Expressionism, until we got this particular gift. So you can go to the East Building and see some of these wonderful things. We've had a few works, and the work that we've always had here is that Lehmbruck that you see on the far right, which is the Seated Youth. The two most important German movements during this period of the war, or at least before the war in the early 20th century, were Die Brücke, the bridge, and the Blue Rider, Der Blaue Reiter. And this is a painting on the left by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, the artist of Die Brücke. It's a painting from 1925. And among the figures who are included in Die Brücke are, of course, Kirchner, but also Otto on the right, Otto Müller, that's Kirchner on the upper right, Erich Heckel, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. This was a movement that was particularly German. Blue Rider is more international. Die Brücke was more concerned with Germany, German art history, resurrecting the German past, especially the importance of the woodcut. This term, Die Brücke, the bridge, has references to all host of things. They saw themselves as a bridge from the past to the future. Of course, this phrase, there's a phrase in Nietzsche and also Sprach Zarathustra, Die Brücke zum Übermensch, the bridge to the Superman, and they liked that particular phrase. Kirchner wrote in the manifesto, this group did produce a kind of a manifesto, and Kirchner says, quote, "We call all young people together, and as young people who carry the future in us, we want to wrest freedom for our actions and our lives from the older, comfortably established forces." Here's Kirchner, who serves in the First World War in his uniform. This is a photograph from 1915. Kirchner's involvement in the First World War and then his subsequent persecution with the rise of the Nazis are tragic stories, and they're sort of bookended by these two self-portraits. This is Kirchner's self-portrait as a soldier on the left from 1915. This is in the Allen Memorial Art Museum in Oberlin. And then in 1934, although it was then reworked in 1937, is the self-portrait on the right. That's in the collection in the Bunderkunstmuseum in Switzerland. So in 1915, after having served in the war, he paints himself in his uniform here on the left. He was in an artillery regiment. And you see him with, essentially it's supposed to be, he's back in his studio, and that's a model that you see, the nude female. But of course, the most interesting part of the painting is the right arm, which has been amputated of its hand. You just see a bloody stump. Kirchner did not suffer an amputation in the war, but he did suffer a psychosomatic. He suffered shell shock for sure, and he was released from the war. But he suffered a sort of psychosomatic paralysis of his right side. He would sometimes be paralyzed and couldn't work, and then other times that would leave. But certainly showing himself with this bloody stump is a symbol of all of the things now that he feels have been lost. It's a symbol for the idea that he can no longer paint. He's lost his creativity. It's a commentary on his potency, on his manhood, all of these things that he feels now have suffered as a result of the war. If he thought that was bad, some years later, when he comes out of the war, he spends time back in Germany, in Berlin, but then he realizes, I can't stay in the city anymore. It's just too cacophonous. So he goes to Switzerland and tries to sort of get rebalanced, you might say. And it works for a while. He paints a lot of landscapes when he's in Switzerland. But of course, in 1933, the Nazis come to power. And even though he's in Switzerland, he's particularly persecuted as a degenerate artist by the Nazis. So he's starting to have his work confiscated by the Nazis, etc. So this portrait on the right of Kirchner, he paints in 1934. But then in 1937, which is the year of the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Munich, he comes back to this painting and he paints out his hands. And he paints out half of his face. And if you notice the wallpaper, it's already taking a pattern of the swastika. In other words, he's handcuffed again. He's impotent. He can't work. And there's this emerging threat that is over his shoulder. This was the final sort of straw that broke his back in a sense, because then he did in fact commit suicide in 1937. Now, German poetry during the war is as prevalent and ubiquitous as British poetry. So let me read you an example from some of the Germans. This is a poem called Requiem for the Dead of Europe. It's by an artist, a poet named Ivan Gold. Ivan, he was Alsace-Lorraine, so he was sort of both French and German. And the poem that he writes is this one. Let me lament the exodus of so many men from their time. Let me lament the women whose warbling hearts now scream. Every lament, let me note and add to the list. When young widows sit by lamplight mourning for husbands lost, I hear the blonde-voiced children crying for God their Father at bedtime. On every mantelpiece stand photographs wreathed with ivy, smiling true to the past. At every window stand lonely girls whose burning eyes are bright with tears. In every garden, lilies are growing as though there's a grave to prepare. In every street, the cars are moving more slowly as though to a funeral. In every city of every land, you can hear the passing bell. In every heart, there's a single plaint. I hear it more clearly every day. That's a poem he wrote in 1917. Now, the other movement that was the counterpart to the Bridge, which came out of Dresden, was the Blue Rider. And this movement came out of Munich and was much more international, both in its membership and in its, certainly in one of its leading figures, who was the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky. So here you see Kandinsky. And his sort of creator of the Blue Rider was the German Franz Marc, who's here with his wife. Here, those are pages, title pages from the Blue Rider Almanac. So they too produced writings that attempted to sort of let the people know what they were attempting to do. And what the Blue Rider was much more about abstraction, modernist principles of formalism and things of that nature. Until recently, we couldn't even show you any paintings by these individuals because we didn't have any. And now we have this painting by Franz Marc through the Saltzman collection. On the left, Weasels at Play from 1911, although currently we've loaned this out. And then August Macke, another original member of the group. This is also from the Saltzman collection. People at the Blue Sea in 1913. Now, Marc is one of the tragic figures here with relationship to the First World War. And I should say Macke as well, because both Franz Marc and August Macke die in the war. And this is a tremendous loss because both artists were just coming into their sort of prime. Macke dies in the second month of the war at the front in France on September 26th, 1914. And then Marc is killed in the Battle of Verdun in 1916. What's interesting about that, and tragic about that, is that after a year or so of the war, the German government decided that we didn't want our artists being killed in the war. So they issued a proclamation to have all artists sent back from the front. That never got to Mark's regiment, and he was killed before those orders of reassignment could reach him. So here is Franz Marc, this little arrow, in his uniform. This is Mark and his wife here. Mark is killed in combat. He distinguishes himself. He's awarded the Iron Cross, First Class. What's amazing about so many of these artists, they all were heroic in their efforts, and they all received from various countries their particular medals for valor and courage. Mark's commanding officer actually wrote about the death of Mark, at least the day that it happened, and he described this they were on a reconnaissance mission, and he writes, the officer writes, that it was, quote, a radiant early spring afternoon. At the foot of the hill, Mark mounted his horse, a tall chestnut bay, and as long-legged as himself. And it was right after that there was a shell explosion. They were bombed, and it spewed out all kinds of shrapnel. And according to those present, the shards of the shrapnel hit Mark with such ferocity that he was nearly decapitated, and it killed him instantly on his horse. This is where Mark was and what he might have accomplished. This is one of the greatest paintings of the 20th century, Fighting Forms from 1914 by Franz Marc. That's in Munich today. So again, this is an artist cut down right in the prime of his career. This is August Macke on the left with Elizabeth Gerhard, who at this time wasn't his wife, but would become his wife. The photograph on the left is 1908. And this is what some people consider to be the last painting of August Macke. That's always something you're skeptical about, is it the very last? But this is called Farewell on the right from 1914. That's in the Ludwig Museum in Cologne today. So what about Kandinsky? Kandinsky's not German, he's Russian. So where's he going? What's he doing? Well, in 1914, Germany declares war on Russia, and Kandinsky is forced to leave Munich, where he spent almost his entire career, a good chunk of it, to return to Moscow. In some ways, he felt more German than Russian at this point. And he says of that, he says, quote, "Of the 16 years that I have been living in Germany, I have given myself entirely to the German art world. How am I now suddenly supposed to feel myself a foreigner?" So this is a painting on the left by Kandinsky called Moscow No. 1 from 1916. And on the right is a photograph of Kandinsky in his study in Munich in 1913. So he leaves Germany and goes back to Russia, but of course he runs right into the growing revolutionary fervor that's going to strike Russia. And he doesn't fare well because he's the son of a relatively wealthy tea merchant. Kandinsky's family had money. He basically was independently wealthy. But after the Russian Revolution in 1917, the new Bolshevik government was seizing the assets, especially of people like Kandinsky's family. So almost all of his assets and properties were confiscated. And in 1921, he leaves Russia, never to return, and he goes to Paris. And then that leads into the later phase of his sort of Bauhaus career. Few artists were as graphic about the suffering, the pain, the shell shock as the German artists, and especially Otto Dix. This is a photograph of Dix on the left from 1920. And then a self-portrait as a soldier on the right from 1914. This is actually painted on two sides, verso recto. I'm not showing you the other side. It's an ink and watercolor. You can sense with the painting on the right that he's in this hellish environment. And that clearly is how he felt about the war. Another poem by a German at this time is by Wilhelm Klemm, K-L-E-M-M. It's written in November of 1914. It's called The Clearing Station. Straw rustling everywhere, The candle stumps stand there staring solemnly. Across the nocturnal vault of the church, moans go drifting in choking words. There's a stench of blood, pus, shit, and sweat. Bandages ooze away underneath torn uniforms. Clammy, trembling hands and wasted faces. Bodies stay propped up as their dying heads slump down. In the distance, the battle thunders grimly on, day and night, groaning and grumbling nonstop. And to the dying men patiently waiting for their graves, it sounds for all the world like the words of God. So these are soldiers holed up in a church while this, and they're all basically sitting against the wall, and they're sort of basically dying, but they can still hear the battle rage. Dix was particularly concerned with the plight of the veteran returning home. And no images were more graphic about the plight, about what we read in Remarque and Hemingway and others about will be forgotten, will be discarded, will be thrown aside. This was the plight of many veterans. So this is Otto Dix's painting on the left called Pragerstrasse, but that just is Prague Street from 1920. And on the right, the Scat Players from 1920. We had both of these paintings in our great Dada exhibition, if you saw that. Probably 20 years ago now. I don't know what that, I don't know. Everything runs together in my head. That was one of the greatest exhibitions we ever had at the gallery, the Dada exhibition. So here you see in both cases, the war has left all of these veterans crippled, deformed. We saw what was happening with the Anna Coleman Ladd trying to fix these facial deformities. People had lost their limbs. They have no legs. They're running around on little carts here. All of this, they're discarded, they're neglected. There's no time for these people anymore. Scat is a card game. And it did have implications at the time that scat was played particularly, it's a three-handed card game, and it was favored by the Krupps, who were the great munition makers, who had made all the instruments of war that had disfigured these individuals. Of course, one group, as it began to sort of assemble and rise to power, that didn't neglect these guys and was interested in getting them now to speak out about their injustices about the war, was the rising National Socialist Party. And here, this individual has already a newspaper that says, "Out Jews, Jews out." So here you see Juden Raus here. So already these individuals were ripe to the message that would now come forward as National Socialism began to coalesce. In 1924, there were a number of artists who were asked to submit, it was the 10th year of the war, to submit portfolios related to the war. Käthe Kollwitz did, I'll show you hers in a second, but also Otto Dix. And these are two prints. These were supposed to be prints. So the series that Dix created was called The War, Der Krieg. And this is an image on the left. The assault troops advance under gas. That's one image. The image on the right, corpse in barbed wire, Flanders. These were etchings with aqua tint. Dix served in the First World War. He served from 1915 on, and he fought on the Western Front. He fought at the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles. He earned the Iron Cross for bravery, second class. These experiences deeply scarred him. So this is how he dealt with it 10 years later. He spoke about his time in the war, and he said, quote, "For years, I constantly had these dreams in which I was forced to crawl through destroyed buildings, through corridors through which I couldn't pass. The rubble was always there in my dreams." This portfolio certainly does not glorify war, doesn't heroize soldiers. It is all about the sort of destruction, the unrelenting suffering, and horrible realities. Dix was an artillery gunner. And he served at the Battle of the Somme, and then he was in fact transferred to the Eastern Front. So he served on both fronts, the Western and the Eastern Front. And so what he focuses on in his series is just dead, dying, shell-shocked soldiers to a large degree. This kind of series for him was a kind of exorcism. It was a way for him to get out a lot of the suffering and the psychiatric and psychological trauma that he was still dealing with. I'll read a poem from another writer, German at this time, is Alfred Lichtenstein, and he writes a poem called Leaving for the Front. So this is on your way to the war. Before I die, I must just find this rhyme. Be quiet, my friends, and do not waste my time. We're marching off in company with death. I only wish my girl would hold her breath. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm glad to leave. Now mother's crying too. There's no reprieve. And now look how the sun's begun to set. A nice mass grave is all that I shall get. Once more the good old sunsets glowing red. In 13 days, I'll probably be dead. Now he wrote that on August 7th, 1914. He was a little short on the days. He died 7 weeks later. So not 13 days later, but 7 weeks later, he was killed. One of the greatest paintings of the war is Otto Dix's Dresden War Triptych, sometimes just called The War, from 1929 to 32. It's 4 panels, as you can see here. I mean, here he is relying on incredible earlier precedents in Northern Renaissance painting, Matthias Grunwald and Hans Holbein and others, to create now a modern kind of altarpiece about war. It can be read from left to right. On the left, we have a column of German soldiers who are marching away through this kind of fog of war towards the central scene. And in the central scene, we see a devastated kind of urban landscape scattered with all kinds of war paraphernalia, body parts strewn everywhere. Then on the right, we have this kind of ghostly, grayish, dominant sort of figure who's trying to help his wounded comrades, and that is a self-portrait of Dix. And then below, which echoes the great painting by Hans Holbein of the Dead Christ, we have some soldiers who are lying next to each other. Maybe they're under an awning or in a tent, or perhaps it's their tomb. It's hard to know for sure. Now, Dix was well aware of the plight of the veterans. I've already mentioned this, and here you see it. This is a Dix drawing on the right called Prostitute and War Veteran, Two Victims of Capitalism, from 1923, and he's dealing with this facial disfiguration that we've already seen, trying to be treated by someone like Anna Coleman Ladd. People didn't know what to do with these veterans, how to approach these veterans, whether to help them, to shun them. There were all kinds of mixed responses when these people came back from the war. They were highly visible in France. France tended to try to reincorporate them into a normal life, but there was an organization called the Broken Faces in France, and this was an organization that did try to help these individuals. Anna Coleman Ladd was sort of part of that whole kind of idea. But in the case of Otto Dix and George Gross, this kind of disfigured veteran was again taken as used almost as a propaganda image against war in general. It was used rather than trying to help these individuals. The image was very often used to be an anti-war statement. And that's true with Gross, certainly. George Gross here volunteered for the military service. He volunteered because he didn't want to be drafted. And he knew if he volunteered, he might not go to the front. But he did go to the front. He served from November 1914 to May 1915. But he was discharged for medical reasons and spent really most of the war in Berlin. This is his great print series or portfolio, God with Us. You see the title, God with Us, here, and a couple of the more famous images. Gross's art was clearly meant to provoke and to be an anti-war statement and to be anti-Weimar Republic, you might say, and all of its. He was certainly a leftist, a communist, was concerned with the rights of workers. At one point when this series came out, one illustrator said, quote, "If drawings could kill, the Prussian military would certainly be dead." So he was defaming the military. He was, in fact, for this portfolio, he was found guilty of sedition or treason along with his publisher. He was forced to surrender all of the copies to the German army. So God with Us here is actually a play. This is what was on the German soldier's belt buckle, this phrase, God with us. What's interesting is that in this series, Grosz wanted the captions to be translated into English and French as well as German. And in English, when this was translated, it said, "God for us." So it was like God was on the side of the English, the British, as opposed to being on the side of the Germans. In the middle, this image is called "Blood is the Best Sauce." And you have these uniformed soldiers who are beating a group of protesters up here. And then there are this officer and a profiteer who make money off the war, just watching this with no real concern for what's happening. And then on the right, German doctors fighting the blockade. You've got this German soldier, a patient, who's like a skeleton, but he's being given the KV, which is German for he's fit for service, to send him back to the front. There are some horrendous stories about soldiers, not just in the German army, who come through. That's what Craig Lockhart was all about in Edinburgh. These soldiers should never go back to the war. But in fact, they were sort of almost robotically programmed, again, to be fit enough to be sent back to the front. It's really a sort of horrible situation. That affected all the armies, not just the German army. Here's Grosz's Suicide on the left from 1916, Gray Day from 1921 on the right. His experiences in the trenches, even for a brief period, just intensified his loathing for German society in general. So he produces these really savagely satirical kinds of paintings and drawings. He said about himself, quote, "I lived in a world of my own. My drawings expressed my despair, hate, and disillusionment. I had contempt for mankind in general." He was bitterly opposed to the war, and he sees German society now as filled with drunkards, sadistic murderers, prostitutes, people who have been maimed and disabled by the war and leading often to suicide, and that's what we have on the left. What was particularly irritating to Grosz was that there was the rise at this time of groups like the women's rights movement, labor movements that were getting attention and were being sort of taken seriously, but that wasn't the case with the veterans. He felt that this was just an ultimate kind of disrespect for what he considered the forgotten veteran. So, getting to Lembruck and Barlach, who are now represented, we've always had the Lembruck sculpture on the left, but the Barlach is a gift of the Saltzmans. And we can talk a little bit about what's going on here. As I'm sure you already know, changes in society and culture don't necessarily follow the calendar. It's not like, okay, now this is the 20th century, so all of that's forgotten. And instead, what we have is the fact that really the 19th century doesn't end until 1918. 1918 spells the end of what 19th century culture was about, that kind of high culture. And so that's reflected in all of these writings that I've been reading to you. It's reflected in the war poetry. It's reflected in music. When Leonard Bernstein wrote about Mahler's 10th Symphony, which he never finished, Mahler dies in 1911, he said that that symphony represents three things for Mahler. It represents his own death, because he knows he has an arrhythmic heart. It represents the death of Western culture in a certain way, Western society, the 19th century, and it represents the death of tonality. Because the second Viennese school, Berg and Webern and Schoenberg, are all going to be different, even though Mahler, much to his credit, supported all of those artists. So that's what we're sort of dealing with here. That gets us to Lembruck. This is a self-portrait on the left from 1902 and a photograph from 1905. Lembruck serves in the war as a paramedic, and he's at a military hospital in Berlin. And what he sees every day are these piles of limbs coming back, people who've been blown up, people who have to have amputations. And this gets reflected in a number of his sculptures. Two of the most famous, one is called The Fallen Man, which is this figure kind of crawling on all fours that I'll show you a little bit later. And certainly that relates to our sculpture at the National Gallery called Seated Youth. Lembruck was also a poet, and he writes a poem about, in essence, about this sculpture. The sculpture is from 1917. The poem was written in 1918, and he says this: "Who has survived this bloodbath? I tramp over this new cut field and look at the harvest of men cruelly mown down. Friends lie silent around me. My brothers are no longer here. Faith, love, everything has disappeared. But death is everywhere, on every flower and every path. Oh, limitless curses on it. You who have made so much death, have you none for me?" This sculpture was subtitled. Sometimes he called this sculpture The Friend. So that it's a sculpture, when you think about it, that is portraying both a mourner and a survivor. It's somebody who seems to have, you could think of it that way, somebody who survived the war and is now missing all of his friends. But it also could just be a universal figure of mourning, kind of meditating over the graves and this loss. What's interesting is talking about when the 19th century ends and all of that. When you think about the history of the seated male nude, Lembruck really breaks the mold here, because going back to the Greeks in the upper left, we have the great boxer, the seated boxer, which is a Hellenistic sculpture. This man may or may not have been defeated. He's certainly bloodied, but he is proud, holds his head up, regardless of what may have transpired. And the Rodin figure of the thinker in the lower right, which epitomizes heroism and idealism, sources in Michelangelo and the Greeks, etc. The way I always describe the Lembruck compared to the Rodin is as if Lembruck just pulled the plug on Rodin, just deflated it, took all the air out of it, and you're left with this sort of gaunt, thin, emaciated sort of figure. What is interesting about this figure is that one of the things that happened in all of the countries that served in the war afterwards is that certainly nobody had ever thought that it would be this kind of carnage and these kinds of casualties and deaths. So every country was unprepared to bury the dead because they didn't have enough cemeteries. So in every country, you saw new cemeteries being built to accommodate the war dead. This was true in Germany. And when a new cemetery was created in Lembruck's hometown of Duisburg, Germany, they chose this figure to be the memorial figure in the cemetery, as this is the Kaiserberg Cemetery, the Kaiserberg War Cemetery in Duisburg. Now, Lembruck serves in the war. He's a paramedic. He's traumatized. He is discharged. He goes to Zurich in 1916. After the war, he's elected to the Prussian Academy, which is a great honor. That's in 1919. But he could never regain his sort of grip on things. And he commits suicide on March 25th, 1919. It's interesting because we talked about Ernst Ludwig Kirchner being then unable to deal with the persecutions of the Nazis as his work was confiscated. Lembruck was dead before the Degenerate Art Show, but his work was still confiscated, and he was considered degenerate sort of posthumously, you might say. And this is a photograph on the left from the Munich show in 1937. It's the room that included Lembruck's great Kneeling Woman. And you see the inscription, they had 4 years. What the Nazis were saying was, we came to power in 1933. These artists had 4 years to clean up their act, and they didn't. So now in 1937, we're going to destroy all this art. And what's interesting is that in the Munich show, this sculpture was there. The next venue, the show traveled throughout Germany. It was going to Berlin for the next venue. And this must have been damaged, we think, in transit. So they pulled it from the show and they replaced it with this sculpture. And that's the sculpture we have at the National Gallery. So this was in the 1937 Degenerate Art Show in Berlin. This is Barlach, who is, again, an interesting figure, photograph in his studio from 37 on the left, and then the young Barlach, it's an undated photograph on the right. He's a sculptor, a printmaker, a dramatist. He creates a very different kind of sculpture. They're small figures. They're religious, sort of mystical. They relate to lots of traditions. He had taken a trip to Russia in 1906, so that he was interested in folk art, peasant art. He studies briefly in Hamburg, in Dresden, off to Paris for a while, and then he's in Berlin, settles in Berlin. And then from Berlin, he makes one last move to his hometown. He goes back to his hometown, which is Güstrow, G-U-S-T-R-O, and remains there, settling in 1910. He had been a medic as well. He volunteered for the war. And then he was accepted as a medic, as a volunteer, and then he was formally drafted and sent into the infantry in December of 1915. He had a heart condition, and he served only 3 months at the front, and then he was discharged. This is the work we now have from the Saltzman collection, The Avenger from 1914 by Barlach. This work was made at the beginning of the First World War. And at the start of the war, Barlach was a nationalist. He thought this was great. You know, we're going to go save the world, and Germany is going to be this unstoppable force, the army. I mean, he was all in, shall we say, until he went to the war. And then he was all out. He went to the war and he saw the carnage, and then he felt incredible remorse for what his earlier stance had been about war during the First World War. So he vowed he would never make that mistake again. And as the Nazis came to power, he was particularly vocal, even at great risk to his life, about being against the Second World War and about being against the rise of National Socialists. He makes a reference to this sculpture in a diary entry, October 5th, 1914, and he calls this sculpture the Berserk Man, ein Berserker. Now this is interesting because this term, Berserker, we even have the English term, Berserk, you're going berserk, has a long history. It actually goes back to Old Norse society, and the Berserkers were very famous warriors in the Old Norse legends and sources who would, prior to a battle, work themselves up into a hysteria, into a frenzy. It's sort of like what football players do now in the locker room. They bang their heads against the locker and everything before they go out. That's essentially the same idea, except the stakes were much higher here. These soldiers would scream, they would bite their shields, and they would get into this sort of frenzy, psychic, berserk state, and then they would go out and fight a battle. So it was a form of self-induced hysteria. And that's how we should think of this sculpture. That's essentially what Barlach was sort of thinking about. What's interesting is that this idea of a berserk state, self-induced hysteria, a berserk state, is actually now part of the language of treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. There are a number of soldiers who prior to a battle remark about getting into this sort of hyper-hysterical state with no concern for their safety, the safety of their comrades, etc. Siegfried Sassoon was famous for one of the reasons he was brought back from the front was because he was in the trenches, and at one moment he just ran across no man's land by himself and towards the German trenches, and the Germans were so shocked that he actually captured the trench because this crazy guy was coming forward, and single-handedly he captured the trench. He was awarded the Military Cross for that. It's interesting. He threw it away. So did Wilfred Owens, threw away his medal. Almost all these individuals threw their medals away if they were awarded medals. Here's the Avenger again. It's a marvelous, I mean, his sculpture is very different. Everything about Lehmbruck is the human figure, open, a lattice work, and everything is closed and very, very compact and tight in Barlach. And then just to mention, and I can't go into a long, believe me, this thing has a huge history about when it was cast and then destroyed and then recast. But by the 20s, Barlach was a kind of a national figure in Germany, and he certainly by this time was making his anti-war views pretty well known. He's in his hometown of Güstrow, and in 26 they're going to be celebrating their 700th anniversary of their cathedral. So they ask him if he would create a monument. So what he creates is this very famous statue that you see suspended here called the Hovering Angel. It has the Hovering Angel, the Floating Angel, it goes by lots of different names. And it seems to be the figure, an evocation of a mother figure, kind of looking, initially she would have been looking west to the killing fields of Flanders. She's grieving, but she's serene. Her hands are folded against her chest, perhaps perpetually grieving for the dead, that kind of idea. So this was installed in Güstrow Cathedral, which is here. And this is the baptistry, the baptismal font. So that was its original installation. That was in 1926, 27. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, this is exactly the kind of thing they hated. So they removed it from the cathedral, and then they sort of spirited it away. But in, we think around 1940, they melted it down to use the metal to make armaments. So they destroyed the sculpture in 1937. It was the exhibition I mentioned in Munich, and then in August 37, they ordered that this angel be removed, and it was melted down for its metal. But unbeknownst to the Nazis, a group of Barlach friends had actually saved the original plaster mold for the sculpture, and that was being held in a foundry in Berlin. And they were afraid that if the Nazis found out that the mold still existed, they would destroy that as well. And then sometime, and in fact, ultimately, the mold was destroyed in the Second World War in a bombing raid. But what they did was to cast another version of the monument in bronze. So they replicated the one that had been melted down. And then this starts to get complicated because it goes off into all the way into and that was not put in Güstrow Cathedral, that was put here. The recast was put in the cathedral in Cologne, the Antonite Church in Cologne, because now by this time we were getting into the East-West Germany, communist, not communist, et cetera. So this all started to transpire. It was in the 50s. The Cold War was very hot in East Germany. And it was in the 50s, to make a long story short, that another cast was made, and that was put back at Güstrow. So now there are two. So this is the original placement here. These are both cast after the original. But in Cologne, they put a plaque on the floor because they sort of turned this into a kind of a commemoration of all those who have fallen in the war. So the plaque on the floor, they just have the dates 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945. When Barlach was at work on this, his closest friend was Katakolwitz. And it ended up that the face of this angel looked a lot like Katakolwitz. So here's Katakolwitz, and here's the head of the angel. What Barlach said about the monument was that he wanted it to be, he felt that the way you dealt with war commemoration was that it should be a monument that was of recollection and inner reflection. So something that was quiet, peaceful, sort of self-possessed in that way. We mentioned Otto Dix's portfolio celebrating the 10th anniversary. This is true with Katakolwitz. She produced her own portfolio. She was asked to contribute. And that's a photograph of her on the right from about 1920. She produced a portfolio of 7 woodcuts and 1 woodcut cover, and she gave it the same title that Dix gave his. She called it The War. And the cover was this figure here that you see, which is known as Widow number 1. And then we have the Sacrifice, number 2. Down here we have the Volunteers. This is Parents. This is the same image of the cover coming back again as the image of the widow. Up here on the top, widow number 1, widow number 2. Then down here are the mothers, and this is the people. Those are the images. What Kollwitz was concerned with was the war's impact on those who are left behind. Mothers, orphans, children, all the people who are affected by war but don't necessarily actually go to the front and fight the war. And that was true because she lost her son, Peter, in the First World War, and then she lost her grandson in the Second World War. So the sense of loss and of protective mothers, you have to look carefully here. This is a group of mothers protecting a child. That sense. The only image that, in this image here, that's the image of her son, who's being sort of grabbed by the figure of death. So she was very concerned with the plight of all of those people who suffer loss, you might say, in that particular way. She and Barlach were very close, and Barlach was particularly persecuted with the rise of National Socialists, to the extent that when he died, the Gestapo really did not want anybody to attend his funeral, because it might seem like he was being turned into a martyr. But Käthe Kollwitz, to her credit, she's an incredibly courageous woman, did attend the funeral of Barlach. Heading to France, this is Max Ernst. He served in the war, and here he is in his uniform on the right, being wounded on the top. And one of his collages from 1920 called The Murdering Airplane. Max Ernst served in both the Eastern and Western fronts. The effect of the war on him, as is so common with all these people, was devastating. In his autobiography, he writes, quote, "On the 1st of August, 1914, Max Ernst died. He was resurrected on the 11th of November, 1918. Murdering Airplane here from 1920, it's a collage, and it is a typical kind of Dada growing into surrealist kind of idea, because you have this plane with these are human arms here. You have 2 soldiers who are helping a wounded soldier. Ernst's shell shock was profound. He suffered hallucinations, dreams. He had a certain mania. And so his post-war psyche was very much challenged. And images and dreams that he would have, things that would come to him from having been on both fronts, got translated into this kind of image that you see here. Of course, he's also speaking here to the idea that this was a mechanized war, that airplanes, tanks, machine guns, there were killing machines during this war that were killing people on a level that was unknown in prior wars. What about Austria? This is Egon Schiele. Schiele, the great Austrian artist, here between 2 comrades. We're not sure who they are. This is a photograph from 1916. Schiele was able to avoid conscription for about a year, and then he got married, and about 3 days after his wedding, he was drafted into the army. He served, initially he was stationed in Prague, but then he was sent to be an overseer in a prisoner of war camp that was filled mainly with Russian prisoners. And this is a drawing he did of one of the Russian prisoners, called Russian Prisoner of War. We know his name, from 1916. It's a watercolor on paper. So he had these, first he was stationed in Prague, then he went to another location for a prisoner of war camp, and eventually by 1917, he's still in the service, but he was sent back to Vienna and spent the rest of his, the war there. But of course, if the war didn't kill you at this time, the thing that did was the Spanish flu, the major pandemic. and this is what killed Sheila. He contracted the flu, and it also killed, I might add, Gustav Klimt. They both died of the Spanish flu. So Sheila died at the age of 28 in the autumn of 1918. Oskar Kokoschka, this story is beyond anything. These are two photographs of Kokoschka in his 15th Imperial Dragoon uniform. He was in the Dragoons serving. Now, Kokoschka's story is beyond, you can't make this stuff up. In 1915, of course, he had been involved prior to with Alma Mahler, the widow of Gustav Mahler. But of course, she was also at the time having an affair with Walter Gropius, the architect. She left no famous man unturned. And in fact, it's Alma, when she wants to kind of get rid of Kokoschka, she's suggesting that maybe he should enlist. He sells one of his most famous paintings, The Tempest, that shows him and Alma Mahler, to have enough money to buy a horse so he can be in the cavalry. And he does, he enlists, but he's a pacifist. And he was a pacifist and a humanitarian by nature. And so he goes in the army and he's determined to try to not kill anybody. Within a year, he's at the Ukrainian front. And his unit is ambushed. And he is shot through the head. And when he falls off of his horse, he's bayoneted through the lungs. And everybody thinks he's dead. He's left on the battlefield. Later, his fellow soldiers come back through to see if, in fact, everybody is dead. And miraculously, Kokoschka is not dead. News has already gone back to Vienna that he's been killed in action. But he hasn't. He lay in near death on the battlefield. He's put into a hospital for convalescence. That takes us up to 1916, and he seems okay. Now, here's a guy who should have been sent home, right? And he's sent back to the front. He's healthy enough, as far as they're concerned, to go back to the front a second time. But now his lungs had never healed properly, and because of the shot in the head, he didn't have his equilibrium, and he would often just get dizzy and kind of fall. And so it was decided, okay, he's probably unfit for further duty. And they sent him to Stockholm in 17 for consultation with a psychiatrist and a brain specialist who could do nothing for him. And so Kokoschka decided at that point he was going to go back to the war, and he was going to just run out into no man's land to get shot. And that's how he would sort of commit suicide. But on the way to doing that, a couple of his friends found him and said, I don't think that's a good plan. And they said he should go into the sanitarium in Dresden. So that's where he went off to Dresden. And he suffered from all kinds of hysteria and mania. And that's during this time in Dresden, that's when he became known as the Mad Kokoschka. Ultimately, he is released, but here's a painting from 1915 called Knight Errant by Kokoschka. That's at the Guggenheim. This whole thing with Alma Mahler was a traumatic, it really is a traumatic experience for him, especially because during this time in 1915, Alma becomes pregnant, and it's with Kokoschka's child, but she has an abortion and she doesn't tell him. And when he learns about this, he's even more sort of devastated by what's happened. This painting has always been seen as a painting that relates to Kokoschka's, shall we say, state of mind at this time. He's a knight errant. He's in this lonely, desolate landscape. There's a winged man bird up here that is a self-portrait of Kokoschka. There's a kind of sphinx-like figure down here that most people take as Alma Mahler. There is an ES here in the sky, which probably relates to Christ's lament on the cross. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In other words, Kokoschka sees himself as both the knight errant and as the martyred Christ here. Kokoschka's story has a happy ending. He does live a very long life, I don't know his death date. He dies like in 1980 or something. So he lives a very, very long life. But this was a kind of a rough spot, shall we say. He had a lot of challenges here. What about the Italians? Okay, here's a photograph on the left of three of the great Italians during the First World War period. Sant'Elena, Antonio Sant'Elia was the great architect. He created especially this visionary architecture that you're probably familiar with. Umberto Boccioni, the great member of the Futurists, and Marinetti, who was the leader of the Futurists. They're all in the service. They all serve in the Italian army. And this is a photograph in 1914. Sant'Elia is killed in the Battle of Isonzo on the Austrian front in 1916. Boccioni dies in the war as well. He dies in a training, he was a cavalryman, and he fell from his horse during a training exercise and was killed, so he wasn't killed in combat. Three of the great, this is the triumvirate of three great losses: August Macchi, Boccioni, and Franz Marc. These three artists were really just fully coming into their own. Here they are. This is Marinetti, and this is Boccioni. Marinetti, of course, writes the Futurist Manifesto. He had written it before the war in 1909. And Marinetti is all for the war because it's going to be this futurist cleaning house. He calls war the great hygiene. We're going to get rid of everything that's obsolete and create a new kind of world. In the manifesto, in Article 9 of the manifesto that Marinetti authors, he talks about war as a necessity for the health of a human spirit, and he goes on to say, quote, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill and contempt for women. It is in Italy that we are issuing this manifesto of ruinous and incendiary violence, by which we today are founding futurism, because we want to deliver Italy from its gangrene of professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antiquaries." So he sees war as sweeping away all of the old riffraff, especially in Italy, and creating a new modern society. Of course, Boccioni is a member of the Futurists. Once anybody is associated with the Futurism goes into the war, they pretty much forget this whole manifesto thing because they see the true horror of it. But this is a great Boccioni painting from 1915, The Charge of the Lancers. Boccioni is killed in that fall in 1916, and he died almost immediately from that fall. Other noted Italian poets, writers in the war, D'Annunzio, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the great writer, poet, playwright. So here's a photograph of D'Annunzio on the left here with a fellow officer in 1915, and on the right, D'Annunzio probably around 1920. He was a pilot, a fighter pilot, and he became really something of a romantic hero in Italy during this time. He was a major figure in a group, today I guess we would call these special operations, special ops. It was a force in the Italian army called the Arditi, A-R-D-I-T-I, the Arditi. Ardire in Italian means to take a dare. And these were like shock troops, and he was part of that. But then he was in the bombing raid over Vienna. And so everything he did in the war was sort of turned into this romantic hero. He survived the war. And so his fame sort of fed even beyond that into the later 20th century. But the more important Italian poet related to the war is Ungaretti, Giuseppe Ungaretti, and here are two photographs. He was a lowly private in the 19th Infantry in the Brescia Brigade. So here is Ungaretti, and a little bit later, this is like 1916, a little bit later, 1917. He was the one who, when he went to war, contrary to all the futurist jingoism, saw what war really was about. And he said at one point, quote, about life in the trenches, he said, quote, "There is no trace in my poetry of hatred for the enemy or anybody else. There is an awareness of the human condition, men's brotherhood and suffering, the extreme precariousness of their situation. One of the things Ungaretti was exposed to in the army was, of course, soldiers who had come from all kinds of different backgrounds, and many of whom were not educated, formally educated. So he was next to farmers and peasants and people of all different walks of life, and they had a different way of talking in Italian. And they had a sort of staccato kind of rhythm and short kind of sentences. That definitely affected Ungaretti's poetry. Then he met the French poet who also served in the war, Apollinaire, and Apollinaire told Ungaretti, maybe you should get rid of punctuation. It kind of slows you down. And so Ungaretti I think Ungaretti is one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and I particularly like his poems are so short, but he writes a poem about the war called Vigil. And it's a situation not unlike that of many soldiers recounting this situation, and that is that they're in a trench or they're in a bomb crater and they're stuck next to somebody who's a corpse and who's dying. And they can't get out of that trench or they'll be shot by a sniper. So they have to spend the night next to this gurgling, sometimes corpse, who very often is a close friend of theirs. So this is the poem called Vigil by Ungaretti. A whole night long crouched close to one of our men, butchered with his clenched mouth, grinning at the full moon, with the congestion of his hands thrust right into my silence. I've written letters filled with love. I have never been so coupled to life. That's the typical Ungaretti poem. Very short, but he gets to the point very, very quickly. France, everybody's suffering in this war. This is a painting by Paul Jouvet on the left, Grave of a Serbian Soldier at Canali from 1917. And then the very famous painting by Felix Vallotton, Military Cemetery at Chalon-sur-Marne from 1917. This kind of painting on the right, which was pretty common, tries to get across to the people the carnage of the war, the loss of life. When you see acres and acres of crosses in a cemetery, there's a service going on up here, a burial service going on in the upper right. George Braque enlists in the French army, and here is Braque on the left in the trenches in 1914, December, and here he is recuperating from his war wounds in the hospital in 1915. He enlists in the French army in 1914. In May 1915, he receives a severe head injury at the Battle of Carency, and he suffers temporary blindness. He's awarded the Cross of War and the Legion of Honor for his bravery at this battle. He's sent back to the hospital, and they're worried about the blindness because there's pressure on his brain from his skull. So he has to undergo a trepanation. You know what that is? Trepanation is when they open up your skull or they drill a hole to relieve pressure. It might be on the optic nerve. He has a long period of recuperation. He essentially loses the entire year of 1915 in the hospital, recuperating. He doesn't really start to paint again until 1916. His eyesight returns. It's Braque who specifically talks about something I mentioned earlier, and that is how he began to see the world differently when he was in the trenches, because he would see views of things in ways that were just so strange. Looking over a trench, for example, and you can't do that. I mean, you can't, if you raise your head. Siegfried Sassoon was shot by friendly fire when he popped his head up above the trench. He was shot by a sniper. So all of this affected the way he sort of began to see the world. The other Frenchman affected by the war is Léger, and this is Ferdinand Léger's Soldier with Pipe, 1916 on the left, Soldiers Playing Cards, 1917. His war experience is significant in relationship to his art. He's mobilized in August 1914. He spends 2 years at the front. He produces a whole number of sketches about artillery pieces and cannons and howitzers and airplanes. And what he comes away with in the war is this fascination with these tubular instruments of war, the howitzer and all of these things that he has seen now up close. And very often, again, he's seen them in strange ways, in a trench just looking out. Or he talks about looking down the barrel of his rifle and seeing the tubular shape of the rifle. And that gets translated into paintings like this. Soldier with a Pipe, 1916 on the left. Soldiers Playing Cards on the right from 1917. Even the kind of metallic palette here, eventually that changes here. He talks about this, and he writes at one point, "I was stunned by the sight of the breach of a 75 millimeter in the sunlight. It was the magic of light on the white metal. That's all it took for me to forget the abstract art of 1912, 1913, the crudeness, variety, humor, and downright perfection of certain men around me, their precise sense of utilitarian reality, and its application in the midst of the life and death drama we were in made me want to paint in slang with all its color and mobility." This ushers in what we call Leger's mechanical period. After the war, he starts to do these mechanical, robotic-like shapes that are tubular, and he kind of combines cubism with the aesthetic of the machine. And that's the new language that he sort of creates. Here are the Duchamp boys. 3 brothers, but they each took a different part of their family name so they wouldn't be confused. So this is Marcel Duchamp, of course. This is Jacques Villon, and this is Raymond Duchamp Villon. So the father's name was Duchamp, the mother's name was Villon, and that's how they separated themselves. The dog is named Pipe, and that's in 1913. Raymond Duchamp Villon creates one of the greatest sculptures of this period. It's the figure on the right, called the horse, the large horse, from 1914. He applies cubism to sculpture, and he's affected, as so many artists were at this time, by the mechanization of the war, the machine, the tank, the machine gun, the howitzer, things that had their own inherent aesthetic. So he takes curves and spirals and arches, and they become like pistons, and they become like mechanical energy as well as animal energy. Here he synthesizes the idea of both the horse and the machine. The horse becomes a machine. It becomes like a locomotive. Of course, he had been looking at Muybridge's photographs on motion from the 19th century. But the horse, which had been a traditional symbol of power, and now he's giving us the horse as a new machine that's replacing a traditional horse. And it's interesting how many soldiers, artists, Boccioni and others, Franz Marc, died while on horseback. And here's Apollinaire in the hospital on the left, March 17, 1916, and then in the spring again on 1916 on the right. He serves in the war. He gets a serious shrapnel wound to his temple, from which basically he never recovers. He's weakened. His immune system is weakened, and when he's released, he dies of the Spanish flu, like Gustav Klimt and Schiele. He had gone to war and served on the front line. He had served in the line between the 2 great battles of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun. And here's the tragedy here. He dies 2 days before the armistice. The armistice was on November 11th, obviously, and he died on November 9th. And one of his poems, and he had a big impact on Ungaretti, but one of his big poems is called Shadow. And by the way, there's no punctuation. It reads, "Here you are beside me again, memories of my companions killed in the war, the olive branch of time, memories that make only a single memory, as 100 skins make only a single coat, as these thousands of wounds make only a single newspaper article, impalpable and dark presence who have assumed the changing shape of my shadow, an Indian on the watch through all eternity, shadow, you creep beside me, but you do not hear me anymore. You will not know anymore the divine poems I sing, but I hear you still and see you still. Destinies, multiple shadow, may the sun preserve you, you who love me so much that you will never leave me, and who dance in the sun without stirring the dust. Shadow ink of the sun, signature of my light, holder of sorrows, a god that descends. This image of the shadow goes through a lot of poetry, and it's the shadow of the war and of memory that these soldiers and veterans carry with them throughout their later lives. In England, we have this painting by C.R.W. Nevinson called Returning to the Trenches from 1914. This is in the National Gallery in Canada, in Ottawa. Nevinson, as you can see here, if you think back to the Boccioni painting I showed you, Nevinson is directly affected by futurism, and he talks about the great machine that is modern war. So he has that same idea. He serves as an ambulance driver, and for the British, he actually becomes the official war artist of the First World War. And again, he initially embraces futurist ideas about war as hygiene and as a necessary cleansing, but then once he gets into the war, he turns his back on almost all the futurist ideas. He becomes much more illustrative, like here on the left. This is Nevinson's Paths of Glory from 1917. By the way, that's a great movie to watch on the First World War by Stanley Kubrick. On the right is a painting by Paul Nash called The Menin Road from 1919. One of the greatest collections of World War I painting, especially obviously related to Britain, is at the Imperial War Museum in London. We come next to this man. This is William Orpen, O-R-P-E-N. He's a fascinating character. This is his painting on the left, Dead Germans in a Trench from 1918. But maybe the image everybody knows, if they know Orpen, is the one on the right called Blown Up from 1917. It's actually a pencil and watercolor. The war raised lots of questions for artists about, you might say, the aesthetics of atrocity. How do we depict these things? Should we depict these things? All of that kind of thing. And Orpen's work is very much at the heart of that. He struggled with a lot of these questions. He became, like Nevinson, one of the official war artists for the Brits. And what he felt was important was to show people at home who had not experienced the war what its horrors really were. And so he said at one point that he wanted people to see, quote, the amputated hand lying on the duckboards, the shell holes with the shapes of bodies faintly showing through the putrid water. That's directly referred to in the painting on the right, Blown Up. This is something he saw, and he never recovered from this vision. He was in the trenches and he saw a wandering soldier, a corpse-like soldier who was alive, but he was wandering through the battlefield. And he, as Orpen said, quote, practically every shred of uniform had been torn from his body by the explosion of a mine. And then Orpen later recalls that the shell-shocked soldier, quote, was wandering crazed and naked, still clinging to his rifle. So this is something he saw. He didn't make this up. And in fact, he could never get this image out of his head, even when he was back home after the war. And so this is the kind of image he felt people should really see. At the opposite side of this image, on the right, would be an image like this, a more symbolic image. This is by George Clawson, the British painter, called Youth Mourning from 1916. So here we have a much gentler, more symbolic portrayal. A naked young woman who probably personifies youth is kneeling in this kind of grief-stricken attitude. There's a cross, and then the battlefield, pockmarked with shell holes, craters from the battlefield, and then just sort of emptiness. This painting seems to relate to Clawson's daughter,
who lost her fiance in the war. And she was so grief-stricken that it touched him, and he tried to deal with it. I'm not going to go through, you can look this stuff up yourself, but the numbers of deaths and casualties, country by country, especially in Great Britain, it was just devastating. This is Jacob Epstein, very famous work in its original shape and form here. This is called The Rock Drill from 1913 to 1915. The way you see it today, all of the rest has been discarded. The way you see it today, cast in bronze at the Tate Modern in London from the work dates to 1913-14. So this talk about the mechanized warrior and the mechanization of war affected Epstein. And originally he creates this mechanized, abstracted human figure in plaster. You have to look carefully. These are his legs. He looks like right out of the Alien movies. And here's his torso here. And what he's on top of is a real rock drill used in mining that was in fact manufactured in the United States. This is about 10 feet tall in its original configuration. And it's interesting because the big part of the drill is right in the phallic kind of crotch of the figure. This is a fascinating figure. You don't really know at times when you look at it if it's an aggressive figure or a figure that's a victim, one way or the other. You can sort of think about it. He exhibited it in London in 1915, the way you see it here together here. But then he showed it about a year later in 1916. And by 1916, some of the bloodiest battles of the war, the Battle of the Somme and Verdun had taken place. And he changed the configuration. He basically dismantled it all, threw away the drill, threw away the legs, took the plaster, and cast it into bronze. And that's the way you see it today if you go to the Tate. Clearly, it seems like if the figure initially had been an aggressive figure, now he didn't want that association to come forward. Now here is interesting because in 1974, there was a reconstruction of the rock drill based on the original photograph I just showed you. This is made of polyester resin and metal and wood. And this was gifted then to the Birmingham Art Museum in Birmingham. So here is the recreation of it today, the way it looked in its original format here. So originally it seems to have been a statement that was positive about machinery, industry, that kind of mechanization, masculine virility, perhaps all of that. When Wyndham Lewis saw the original sculpture, as you see it on the right, he was in this mode. He said, quote, "That is one of the best things Epstein has done. The nerve-like figure perched on the machinery with its straining to one purpose is a vivid illustration of the greatest function of life, to be a machine," this kind of idea. But then in 1940, when Epstein showed the sculpture again, he wrote, and now he was just showing this part of it that he had created. He changed his mind about how he wanted to describe it. And he wrote in 1940, which is now right on the cusp of the Second World War. He said, "My ardor for machinery, short-lived, expended itself upon the purchase of an actual drill, secondhand, and upon it I made and mounted a machine-like robot, visored, menacing, and carrying within itself its progeny, protectively ensconced. Here is the armed, sinister figure of today and tomorrow. No humanity, only the terrible Frankenstein's monster we have made ourselves into." Now he was negative about the figure. Now it was like tampering with nature. It was a Frankenstein's monster. Let's not forget Russia. I talked about those pointing recruitment posters that we had in Germany, in America, and in England. This is the Russian version on the left. This is a Soviet recruitment poster from 1917, and it's the script is saying, have you signed up with the volunteers? And then the one on the right is from 1916, and this is a call for donations for maimed fighters. Russia enters World War I on August 1st, 1914, when Germany declares war against the Russian Empire. And immediately the Russians are able to muster 2 million soldiers, given the size of their country, to fight in the war. This initially, just like these other countries, has an initial feeling of patriotism and great kind of jingoism about the war. So they renamed the city of St. Petersburg at this time Petrograd, and people who had German roots to their surnames changed them to Russian roots. There's all this kind of fervor for the war. But of course, as soon as the war begins and the casualties start racking up, there's a period of great social unrest, and this will feed ultimately right into the biggest issue for Russia at this time, and that's the collapse of the empire as we approach the Russian Revolution of 1917. Lenin had been relegated to Western Europe. In fact, he was in Germany for a while. The Germans very smartly put him on a train and sent him back to Russia because they knew as soon as he got back, he would foment revolution, and that would probably pull Russia out of the war. And they were absolutely right. He had been exiled, is the word I was looking for. In any case, once the Bolshevik government came in after the revolution, they signed the peace treaty to get out of the war on March 3rd, 1918. So they ended Russian participation in the conflict. In fact, in later years after the war, when we had the Soviet Union, the reference, whenever anybody would talk about the First World War, they would always refer to it as an imperialist battle. But there are a number of important artists who emerged at this time, none more important than Natalia Goncharova. This is a portfolio she produced called Mystical Images of War from 1914. It's a series of 14 black and white lithographs as a portfolio. These are just two. Angels and airplanes on the left, and the common grave on the right. Goncharova is one of the most important artists in the first half of the 20th century in Russia. And here, her take on the war is very different. It's not about all the shooting and the killing and the maiming. It's a much more spiritual, much more melancholic and symbolic idea. So here, these airplanes are being sort of guided by angels. Here, there's a mass grave. It's a common grave, but interestingly enough, she puts all different nationalities in the grave. Here's a German with a pointy helmet here. So she's speaking more symbolically to the whole idea of war and certainly she's looking back at her Russian roots. Her art is affected by Russian icons, Russian folk art, all kinds of earlier traditions that she was resurrecting along with her husband, Mikhail Larionov. She has a fascinating career. She was interested in children's art, all of these ideas. She became very important, especially in Paris, as a set designer for ballets and for theater. And here we have, talking of who I would choose as a Russian poet, there was no debate. It was going to be Anna Akhmatova, and this is a portrait of her on the right from 1914 by an artist named Olga Delovos-Kardovskaya. And this is a photograph of Anna Akhmatova. She's one of the greatest Russian poets of the century. She'd been nominated for the Nobel Prize, I think, several times. The poem I want to read, though, is one of the World War I poems. And it's called July 1914. It's actually fairly long. I'm just going to read the first kind of stanza. All month a smell of burning, of dry peat smoldering in the bogs. Even the birds have stopped singing. The aspen does not tremble. The God of wrath glares in the sky. The fields have been parched since Easter. A one-legged pilgrim stood in the yard with his mouth full of prophecies. Beware of terrible times, the earth opening for a crowd of corpses. Expect famine, earthquakes, plagues, and heavens darkened by eclipses. But our land will not be divided by the enemy at his pleasure. The Mother of God will spread a white shroud over these great sorrows. That's her poem, July 1914. This is John Singer Sargent's great painting titled Gassed from 1919. It's at the Imperial War Museum in London. Sargent, of course, is the child of expatriate Americans and spent most of his life abroad. In 1918, the British government asked him to paint a major picture to commemorate the war. This is what he came up with. He did travel to the French front line, and he saw a group of blinded soldiers who are suffering from a gas attack, and they were doing exactly what you see here, shouldering each other as they move through, which is exactly what I showed you here in an earlier photograph. Here, although this is a British regiment on the right. We have Marston Hartley. Hartley, of course, is an artist who is interesting because he was so plugged into modernist art in the early 20th century related to Cubism especially, and Picasso. But during the war years, he had actually been living in Berlin, and he had a great affection for Germany and for Berlin. The war breaks out. He has a personal investment in the war because the man who was his partner in life, his lover in life, was in fact a Prussian soldier. But images like this on the left, the Arrow from 1914, this is where he's really sort of purely in the mode of kind of celebrating all of the pageantry of the war in terms of various escutcheons and insignia in a general kind of sense. It's an energetic painting, it's colorful, it's abstract, it has references to Fauvism, to Cubism. I mean, he's aware of all of these things. He had met Picasso through Gertrude Stein during one of his visits to Paris around 1912. So he's plugged into all of that. The painting on the right, however, which is called Berlin Abstraction from 1914-15, is more personal. Almost everything here, the escutcheons and the epaulettes and the troop number and regiment and all of the things here are more specifically related to his partner. His partner's name was Karl von Freiburg. He was a young German lieutenant, and he was killed in action during the First World War. So it's a much more personal use of modernist imagery in that case. Here again in America, we had the same thing. A painter like Childe Hassam, we have this painting in the gallery, Allies Day, May 1917, which dates 1917. Hassam, we would say, was a hawk. He was all for the war. Again, he was celebrating it, thinking this was going to be a great kind of victory for the Allies. So he shows Fifth Avenue bedecked with all of these flags, essentially the British Union Jack, the French tricolor, and the Stars and Stripes. Talking about this painting, he said he wanted it to sort of celebrate the coming together of our three peoples in the fight for democracy. So he's kind of bought into the Wilsonian, the war to end all wars, the war to save democracy, all of these kinds of things. So that's what you see in the painting on the left. But contrary to that is John Sloan on the right. Now, John Sloan was, as you probably know, a leftist. He was the editor of The Masses, the main socialist journal, along with George Bellows and others. And so he was a socialist, he was a man on the left. He found the war to be an obscenity, especially because it was fueled by capitalist greed, just as George Gross in Germany had sort of dealt with. So he shows us in this drawing on the right, it's a charcoal and crayon. It's titled, After the War, a Medal and Maybe a Job. And what you have is a wounded veteran he's dragging his entrails. And he's coming to this fat capitalist who is going to give him a medal for his service, but probably not a job. This is the same kind of idea we saw in Germany. George Gross's Gray Day on the left. This is the profiteer, the capitalist who makes money off the war, this wall, whether it's going up or down, it's hard to say, but this wounded veteran is being totally ignored. Same idea here, and this idea carried across a lot of nationalistic boundaries. You would find it in Germany, you found it in America. George Bellows, we had this picture in the big Bellows show that we did, Return of the Useless from 1918 on the left. And a later work that doesn't pertain specifically to the First World War, although in some ways it does. It's Parade to War, allegory from 1938 on the right by John Stewart Curry. The Bellows was a haunting image, and it related to a very specific event, and that was the brutalization of Belgian citizens by the Germans, and as they marched through Belgium to attack France. And they were subject and deported off to labor camps, many of the Belgian citizens. So what Bellows is showing us is the return of these Belgians who had been in these labor camps. And they're useless now. They're broken, and they can no longer really perform any function. There was a series of images in this that dealt with this theme he called it the War Series. They were paintings and prints and drawings that were made in response to the atrocities of the First World War. There's a lot of controversy about these images, to the degree to which the Germans had actually perpetrated these atrocities. There's no doubt there were atrocities, but it seems that many of the accounts of the atrocities in the newspapers were exaggerated, in part to try to draw America into the war and get us off of the idea of being neutral. There was a commission in Britain created, the British Bryce Commission. They made a report in 1915. And they found certainly that there were atrocities, but that many of the accounts in the newspapers and elsewhere were probably exaggerated. I show you the John Stewart Curry only to show you the relationship between the First World War and the Second World War, because now in 1938 in America you have a country conflicted between isolationism and intervening in what's going to be happening in Europe. And so Curry is showing you soldiers again already marching as skeletons and as corpses, wanting us to remember what the lessons of the First World War really were. Georgia O'Keeffe on the left, The Flag from 1918, and on the right, Charles Birchfield, Untitled, Camouflage Design from 1918. In the fall of 1917, O'Keeffe visited her younger brother, who was in a Texas military camp being prepared to ship out to the war, and she was highly conflicted about him serving in the war. She was basically hostile to the idea of the war. She was worried about her brother, obviously, and in fact she had reason to be, because he was felled by mustard gas in France and eventually died from its effect. So she painted this watercolor called The Flag, which was very controversial in many ways. It shows this kind of blood red flag, as if the flag is almost bleeding, and it's in these bruised kind of blue clouds. That was for her both a political statement and a kind of reflection of her fears. What's interesting is that she didn't exhibit this painting until 1968. And the reason for that was that in 1917, the Espionage Act was issued in the United States, and she was concerned that this would be seen as a treasonous or seditious kind of imagery, so she kept it actually sort of out of public view. Charles Birchfield on the right, he made every effort to stay out of the war. He was living with his family in Ohio, and he was fearful of being drafted. And he was so fearful before he even got drafted that he had nightmares. And he had nightmares of these grotesque faces and masks and all of these kind of grotesqueries. And then indeed, he went off to the army, and what he did was to take some of those horrific images that he had dreamt and turn them into camouflage designs. Here, a lot of artists did camouflage designs during the war. Horace Pippin here. This is a great painting by Horace Pippin, the ending of the war, starting home, 1930 to 33. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Pippin, as you know, he's a self-taught artist, and he works on this painting some 15 years after his experience in the First World War. He had served in France. He had been wounded. He had been paralyzed in the right arm. He was a member of only 4 African-American regiments that saw combat during the war. So painting helped him kind of recover. Eventually his movement came back. He tried to live a life of solitude, if not literally hiding from people, in Chester, Pennsylvania. But the person who discovered him, or at least learned about him, was Albert Barnes. And once Barnes found him, forget your anonymity, he started buying works from Pippin, and that brought him to greater attention, and in fact he ended up being included in an exhibition at MoMA in 1938. This painting reflects his trauma of the war. He said what the war did to him was, quote, "It brought out all of the art in me." So here we see a German soldier with upraised arms. He's trying to surrender in the trenches. There are bayonet-bearing soldiers around him. There are other little vignettes of soldiers who are falling, who are wounded, all these little front-line confrontations. Some are seeking safety, some are running into the forest. It's an incredible painting. And then he made the frame as well. And the frame is all various kinds of military helmets, escutcheons, things that represent all of the various services represented, say, as French and British and German weaponry and helmets. And this painting is very thick. If you see it in Philly, I mean, it's got a lot of paint on it. And here's a guy who has fallen through the cracks unjustifiably, another American. This is Claggett Wilson, Claggett, C-L-A-G-G-E-T-T. And he's actually from Washington, D.C. He was born in D.C. in 1887. Really, his career takes place in New York. He was a lieutenant in the First World War. He was stationed in France. And he creates the most amazing portfolio of paintings of the war. All of them today, with just a few exceptions, are at the Smithsonian American Art Museum at SAM here in D.C. And they just have everything included. And I picked out one of the best from the point of view of abstraction. This painting on the left is a watercolor and pencil. Most of them are. It's titled "Flower of Death, the Bursting of a Heavy Shell, not as it looks, but as it feels and sounds and smells." This is an amazing portfolio of work by an artist who should be better known for this work. If you go online, you can find the whole portfolio. You can look through these for yourself. This dates to 1919. That is Claggett over here in France. A lot of this is heading in one direction, and it kind of coalesces, I think, in finally Dada. There is no movement in the, let's say, the post-war period, because most of it takes place in the post-war, that was a more vicious and graphic and sarcastic response to the tragedy and the mayhem and the death of the First World War than the Dada movement. Here is the page of the original manifesto written by Tristan Tzara in 1918. And on the right is the grand opening of the Dada exhibition, the first Dada exhibition in Berlin on June 5th, 1920. Those of you who remember the Dada show, we recreated this room in the exhibition. When you came up the stairs to the Berlin section of the show, this is what you saw. This is a German soldier with the head of a pig here, German officer, I should say. And you have almost everybody who's important seated around here. Raoul Hausmann, Hannah Hawk, George Gross, John Hertfield, they're all in that photograph. Dada is sort of the final nihilistic statement on the absurdity of the war, the cruelty, the waste of the war. There's no way I can give you a full kind of visual on this, but let's read a little bit of the manifesto from Zara. How can one expect to put order into the chaos that constitutes that infinite and shapeless variation, man? The principle, love thy neighbor, is a hypocrisy. Know thyself is utopian, but more acceptable, for it embraces wickedness. No pity. After the carnage, we still retain the hope of a purified mankind. We have thrown out the crybaby in us. Any infiltration of this kind is candied diarrhea. To encourage this act is to digest it. What we need is works that are strong, straight, precise, and forever beyond understanding. Let each man proclaim, there is a great negative work of destruction to be accomplished. We must sweep and clean, affirm the cleanliness of the individual after the state of madness, aggressive, complete madness of a world abandoned to the hands of bandits who rend one another and destroy the centuries. Every product of disgust capable of becoming a negation of the family is Dada, a protest with the fists of its whole being engaged in destructive action, Dada, knowledge of all the means rejected up until now by the shamed-faced sex of comfortable compromise and good manners, Dada, abolition of logic, which is the dance of those impotent to create, Dada, abolition of memory, Dada, abolition of archaeology, Dada, abolition of prophets, Dada, abolition of the future, Dada. So these guys are relatively nihilistic, and that is reflected. I can't give you, there are so many images now, but let's go back to the father and to Marcel Duchamp. This is the image on the right, LHOOQ from 1919, which is a postcard that he has drawn a goatee and mustache and then added these letters to a commercial postcard of the Mona Lisa. And of course, when you pronounce those letters in French, LHOOQ in French, it's saying that she has a hot ass. And what he's doing by saying that is he's answering the proverbial question of Western culture, why is she smiling? But he's turned her into a graffiti, into a subway image. This is the woman, this is the painting that represents high culture, represents everything noble and civilized about the world. And now in the Dada period, after the First World War, this is just senseless. And then, of course, Duchamp's great work, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, subtitled To Large Glass. Here you see it in Philadelphia from 1915 to 1923. In essence, what this is an image of sexual intercourse gone amok, in which the bachelors down here try to drive up their love juices, these are Duchamp's terms, up to the bride up here. But of course, this is an endless, senseless, negated act of futility and typical for a world that is now, why should we even think about procreating after the First World War? So that's my story. This is The Fallen Man by Lembrook that I made a reference to. This is the great quote by Wilfred Owen that's today in the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. If you want to, I doubt if you want to spend any more time, but here is a bibliography if you want to jot down a few things. I didn't make it extensive, but if you're looking for a collection of poetry, there are many. The one I've been reading from is a very old one, but during the last year, because it was the anniversary, many new things came out, and this is a good, where is it? Right here. Poetry of the First World War, an anthology, Tim Kendall. So that might be one if you're looking for just one book of poetry, that is a good one. There are some really important books on this list. Certainly in just terms of the First World War, Paul Fussell's work, The Great War in Modern Memory, is a major, major work. And I'm not going to go through. But here's the catalog of our Dada show. Leah Dickerman. which will give you a lot more information about data. I can't believe there are any questions, but I'll ask. Are there any questions? Okay, I can't thank you enough for staying. Thanks very much.